Great. Good evening and welcome to the special meeting of the Caneo Open Space Conservation Agency for Wednesday, April 8th, 2026. We'll begin with a call to order, and Director Nichols, if you would please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Ready, begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Director Engler?
Here.
Director Huffer?
Yes.
Director Nichols?
Yes.
Vice Chair Sullivan is absent. Chair Newman?
Here. I see we have no presentations and announcements and no public comments, correct?
Correct.
Thank you. We move now to the consent calendar, which is one item, the minutes from our February 18th meeting. Entertain a motion on that.
I move the minutes.
I'll second.
Thank you. Will the clerk please take a roll call vote?
Director Engler?
Yes.
Director Huffer?
Yes.
Director Nichols?
Yes.
Chair Newman?
Aye.
Motion carries 4-0. Director Sullivan absent.
Thank you. So we move to our first action item of the evening, which is an authorization to accept a multi-use trail easement in the North Ranch open space.
I will take this one. Thank you. Tonight we have on this agenda item specifically, we have two actions. One is to find the following actions are exempt from the California Environmental Quality Act pursuant to CEQA Guidelines 14 CCR sections 15061 and 15317, and also to approve resolution 2026-01, which is the authorization to accept a trail easement from Maestro Productions LLC and for the COSCA co-administrative officer to execute all necessary documents thereto. I have a slide to put up for you. So among COSCA's trails in the North Ranch open space is the Hillcrest Ridge Trail, pictured on the slide for you. A portion of this historic trail, measuring approximately 480 feet, is currently located on private property at 3948 Skeleton Canyon Circle. There is currently no easement granting trail access at this location, however. The City of Thousand Oaks is currently processing a development application for the property down at the bottom of the hill, closer to Westlake Boulevard and Skeleton Canyon Circle. And as part of the development application, the city has conditioned the development for granting of this easement. The trail described above lies along the western portion of the subject property at APN 690-0-010-015. Accepting the easement offered completes the formal protection of COSCA's existing Hillcrest Ridge Trail. So staff recommend approving resolution 2026-01, accepting the easement and authorizing the COSCA co-administrative officer to execute the easement and accompanying certificate of acceptance. You'll notice in the board package we circulated a draft trail easement. We're still waiting on the grantor's surveyor to prepare the legal description. So once we get the legal descriptions back from their surveyor, we have them reviewed over in the Public Works Department at the city just to confirm they're correct. Then we'll insert that into the easement prior to recording. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions of staff? Director Engler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just the staff report did cover it, but this is this easement has already been talked to with the property owner. The property owner is fine with it.
Yes, it's a development condition, so it's just part of the process.
Thank you.
They're aware.
Are there any other questions? Director Nichols.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Vice Chair, Chair for the day.
With the existing trail over private property, and I imagine it's been that way for many, many years, just curious if there's any discovery as to how that evolved, where it was placed over private property, and was it known beforehand, or was this just a recent discovery? I just was wondering how this kind of came to be.
No, this has been known for a long time. When COSCA accepted, well, with most of our open space that we've accepted, it comes pre-trailed in some cases where the social trails already exist on the property. This trail in this location goes back to the oldest air photos we have. So it's been a long time public use area. So, and there are other areas throughout our trail system where our trail does cross over onto private properties where we don't have easement coverage on all of them. But we are working on the ones that we can get to here to try and wrap up as many as we can.
Okay, all right. I'm always curious as how these things evolve over time, but thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any other questions? Director Huffer?
Yeah, I was just curious, were there any fences or other improvements on this portion of the property that are going to have to be altered in some way?
No, there's really no infrastructure up there. And the actual assessor parcel that the trail would be on, it really can't be developed. It doesn't meet the city's development standards. It's a steep slope. So they're really, the development's going to happen down on the valley floor below, and there really isn't anything to do up there. So there's no existing infrastructure, and we don't need to add any.
Okay, so we're not really changing anything. It's just going to have a right to use the trail, which
Yeah, it's
we
just-
haven't in a long time. So,
It's-
okay, good.
Paperwork to sew things up.
I just have one quick question on the staff report alluded to Chumash notification that the Barbareño Ventureño board was notified, no response. So,
That was actually for a different agenda item that we
oh, I'm
did
sorry.
that consultation.
I'm sorry.
So
That's
went-
the next item.
Yeah, that
Sorry.
went with our weed management.
I'm misreading my notes. My apologies. I have no questions on this
I will
item.
make sure to cover that when the time comes.
My apologies. That is an upcoming item.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Are there any other questions on this item? See, I promised at least one rookie mistake tonight. That's it. All
So,
right.
I mean, I can restate our objectives, or you can read off the agenda, the actions we're requesting. That is to make a CEQA finding that the acceptance of the easement is exempt from the California Environmental Quality Act, and then you'll be approving resolution 2026-01.
Director Huffer.
I'd like to move approval of staff recommendations 1 and 2.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Will the clerk please prepare us for a vote?
Director Engler?
Yes.
Director Huffer?
Yes?
Director Nichols?
Yes.
Chair Newman?
Aye.
Motion carries 4-0. Director Sullivan absent.
Thank you. Now we move to item B, item 6B, the approval of a COSCA invasive plant management plan, the IPMP, and adoption of the initial study and mitigated negative declaration, the ISMND, for the IPMP. Mr. Stark.
That's a lot of acronyms.
It certainly is.
So, but I guess that's what
We,
happens in
we,
government.
we have an impressive array of acronyms here.
Exactly. So we have a couple of findings that we'll be asking for tonight. One is a finding that based on the whole of the record before COSCA finds that the mitigated negative declaration was prepared in compliance with the California Environmental Quality Act. That's Public Resources Code 21,000 and the state CEQA guidelines 14 CCR 15,000, and reflects the independent judgment and analysis of COSCA. Second is the finding that the initial study identified potentially significant impacts related primarily to biological resources, cultural resources, hazards, and hazardous materials, and that revisions to the project and incorporation of mitigation measures would avoid or reduce all potentially significant impacts to a less than significant level. Next is to find that based on the whole of the administrative record, COSCA finds that there's no substantial evidence that the project, as mitigated, may have a significant effect on the environment. Find that the mitigation measures identified in the mitigated negative declaration have been incorporated into COSCA's invasive plant management plan or will be incorporated into the scope of work for all any specific projects and scopes of work. Finally, to adopt COSCA's invasive plant management plan and approve resolution 2026-02, which pertains to the mitigated negative declaration. Now, COSCA's primary mission is the protection and stewardship of natural resources on a growing open space system, which will soon measure up to about 13,000 acres. Among the most pervasive threats to ecological health of the open space system are invasive plant species. Invasive plants are those that are not native to our region. They do not have natural population controls, and they thrive in areas where their habitat needs are met. These species can outcompete native plants, but do not provide for the habitat needs of local wildlife. The result is a degradation of habitat quality. However, control of invasive plants species can stem the loss of habitat quality and actually expand habitat volume. So enter the invasive plant management plan. In the coming years, COSCA anticipates expanding project areas throughout the open space system, and a more systematic plan was needed to prioritize the species and project areas, describe the methods to be used, and ensure that the expanding work does not result in negative impacts on the environment. In the past, we were working on small area projects that were small enough to fit in with categorical exemptions on CEQA, but to really expand the way we need to protect the open space, a programmatic approach was really needed. So to ensure thoughtful planning for the invasive species management, COSCA staff prepared the invasive plant management plan. Plan describes the plan area setting, including the geography, climate, drought and fire regimes, historic land uses, and general character of vegetation communities as they exist now. It also contains a list of invasive species that have been observed on COSCA property or are found near COSCA property, and they have been classified into treatment priorities. So we have priorities 1, which is our highest priority, down to priority 3. The overarching framework for this plan is integrated pest management, so IPM, another acronym for you. This is a strategic approach to controlling invasive non-native plant species that emphasize ecological balance and long-term sustainability, rather than relying, solely on one treatment or solely on herbicide, for instance. IPM combines multiple tactics such as manual and mechanical removal, biomass reduction, habitat restoration, and targeted herbicide applications to reduce the spread and impact of invasive species. The goal is to minimize harm to the ecosystem while effectively managing the invasive plants. As a project under CEQA, adoption of the IPMP must include documentation of CEQA compliance, and that's where we bring in our initial study and mitigated negative declaration. Because the IPMP includes practices that may have the potential to cause significant impacts, and these impacts can be reduced to a less than significant level through mitigation measures, COSCA prepared an initial study and a mitigated negative declaration as the form of our compliance. A notice of intent to adopt a programmatic MND was recorded with the county clerk on January 20th of this year. And that began a 32-day public and agency review period in accordance with CEQA guidelines 15073. Normally it's a 30-day thing, but because of the way the dates worked out and weekends and a hiccup in the recording, we left it open for 2 more days to make sure that all of our agency partners got a fair crack at it. At the conclusion of the comment period, however, no comments were received from the public or any of the public agencies notified. A notification here was also sent to the Barbareño and Ventureño Band of Mission Indians Cultural Resources Department on January 12th of this year, providing a 30-day period to invite tribal consultation. And during that period, no response was received. So based on the whole of the record, including the initial study, mitigated negative declaration, and mitigation measures, COSCA staff determined that the IPMP, as mitigated through the practices in the MND, will avoid or reduce all potentially significant impacts to a less than significant level. Upon approval, COSCA staff will file a notice of determination with the county clerk and or state clearinghouse as applicable within 5 working days, which Anna has already booked us a meeting tomorrow morning with the county clerk to move that part forward. So with that, that's the basics. I'm available for questions.
Very good, thank you. Are there questions of staff on this item? Director Nichols.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you for the report. I was very impressed with the details. Obviously, there's a lot of length here. Kind of reminded me of some of the materials I had to read when I was doing pest management. However, I do have a few questions. One is how to prevent reinfestation post-treatment. Did I miss that? I didn't really see anything to address that.
It's in there. It may not be in its own section, but it's under a general description of adaptive management within the plan. So whenever we initiate a project, the project comes with a project plan. We implement it, but there's always a monitoring component to it. So we'll be monitoring the sites each year to observe the results of our work, and then we'll modify methods based on the success of what we've implemented. Sometimes we will find in any habitat management project that, sometimes the plan doesn't yield the results you want. So, exactly. So, and it really depends on the species too. Some of these species are, I guess, easier to get rid of and to exhaust the seed bank. Some have very persistent seed banks, and so you're going to have to stay on those sites longer. So we capture that the maturity of the site, and what do we do if it's not working within the adaptive management program for each project. So it's going to handle it as a project basis.
Okay, all right. Kind of a follow-up to that, I guess, as far as how you progress with that. On table 3, where you have the priority 1, 2, and 3 listing, I understand how you came up with that and how those are identified. My question is, for example, in the priority 1 category, you've got more than a dozen identified. So do you further have a priority of priority 1s, where if you say, hey, this is like our most aggressive, our most of concern, we want to target that one first, or how do you go about implementing the plan? Because lots of information here, but I was looking for where's the button that says you push go, and that's where you start, based on all this information. And I didn't see that part. So I'm wondering, how do you know where to start and when?
Some of this, it goes back to historic approaches, like where we've already been working on small scales just to expand it. Because we've already had success with a number of these species in certain locations. We've decided to invest more in those areas because we're already seeing the results of the work. In terms of priorities, generally we're looking at, like, Arundo, for instance, has been a priority just because it has the most different types of impacts. It wipes out native habitats. It's a fire hazard. Same with the fan palms. It earns a priority based on the extent of its potential damages and the extent to which these species exist in any certain place within the open space. So as part of the plan, you'll see that we basically inventoried where the things are. So staff already has a familiarity with these species. So what you'll see in another item on our agenda later is I think we'll address what your question is about, in terms of we have identified areas that are the priority areas. The priority 1 species are unique in that they justify working in any given area on their own. The secondary and priority 3 species, we look at those where we can get them opportunistically while we're doing other things. So, when we look at a project site, it's not always just, oh, we're going to go get this one species. It's what we're looking for is what is our desired result on the ground there, and then we'll look at what species we have and implement those plans that way. So there's still a second. This is a programmatic document, so it has sort of catch-all strategies, but the follow-on to this will be individual projects, and you'll see those proposed in the next agenda item.
Okay. Yeah, because I understand the programmatic approach, but I was also looking at this, if you said, here's our plan, now go do it. And you gave it to somebody, whether it's a staff member or a contractor, I was kind of looking for, step 1, step 2, step 3, where to get started and why pick this one over this one and so forth. And it sounds like you're relying a lot on experience from staff over the years and past practices. And I was hoping to find something to kind of put all that together, where it kind of gives you a step of, like I said, how to start and when.
We get that. The difficulty is that everything that's happening out on the ground is in flux and constantly changing. So we didn't want our plan to be too set in doing this one thing, because environmental conditions can change, and then the project changes. So I think if we're looking geographically at where our focus, it's mostly geared around the geography of where our enhancement sites are. So it's not just killing a weed, it's what habitat type are we working within, and trying to write a prescription for this piece of land. The location of any individual species takes us to that property in that area. But when it comes down to project plan, that it will take a little additional planning on top of that.
Okay.
Say, well, what methods would we implement to achieve our desired outcome?
Yeah, because I did notice as you were kind of listing the different treatment options for each of the different species, that there are some instances where it's like, okay, we've hardly seen this at all anywhere in the open space, or we really haven't seen this one. But now you're kind of planning ahead that if it does happen to show up, this is how you take care of it. And then you have the arundo, which is everywhere, and it's like you don't have to go looking for it; you can just find it. And I know there's a whole spectrum in between. And so, obviously you need to rely on the boots on the ground, the people that are out there, whether it's the rangers, the staff, to kind of pick those out. And I know money is part of the package too, but I'm just thinking of, how you go forth. And I presume it's just that constant feedback of, how things go season by season, rainfall, no rainfall, how things unfold. But I will look forward to that, I guess, the project level, as to how you reach the decision on following this plan, how that it led to that project.
Mm-hmm. And I think you'll get that from we have another item on our agenda that is project specific, so hopefully that'll help kind of show the pathway. The purpose of the secondary purpose of the plan and the CEQA document is just because we're looking at things programmatically and long term, that we thought the programmatic level document here was the most appropriate to address CEQA compliance and things like that. But when individual projects are scoped out and the scope of work is developed, that will be where those are the details that we'll be giving to a contractor to go implement at this specific location. And right now, we've been working at a lot of different locations over the past years. So our primary commitment is to finish the job we started on those. So we're probably working on those. This year we're adding a few new areas just to expand the program by design. But
Okay.
a lot of our initial project choices will be based on defending the work we've done in the past and completing the job.
Mhm. Super. Well, thank you. We were, several of us on the dais here were at the Ventura County Special Districts Association meeting last night. We had a nice presentation from the Channel Islands superintendent, National Park superintendent,
Mhm.
and of course their whole effort on, returning islands, entire islands, and the marine life, see, kind of to reflect their natural beginnings. What a hurdle that they're faced with. And of course, I've had that in my mind as I was reading through this. I thought, well, thank goodness we don't have islands that we need to worry about. But nonetheless, it's quite a challenge. So thank you for putting forth the effort to put this together.
Other questions, Director Engler?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thanks for all the hard work on this. This is a nice document, a nice snapshot in time, so to speak. And appreciate you going through all this and really identifying areas that need treatment and everything else. It's funny that Director Nichols was saying that the islands are, a particularly hard place to do. I'm thinking our task here is even harder because the islands at least are somewhat isolated,
Mm-hmm.
and then you can kind of take it a little bit by little bit. Here, to your point earlier, we're adjacent to other areas that have these same plants and invasive species. And how do we prevent that reinfection, so to speak, is a problem that we'll have to deal with. I'm not sure how we would go about that other than being very on top of it all the time.
Yeah, I don't think we get away with not being out on the land and monitoring the invasive species that we have. Because as Director Nichols mentioned, there are species that are in our general area that just haven't been found on COSCA property yet.
Mm-hmm.
But early detection and rapid eradication is really a top order activity. If we get one of these really bad ones and it's small, we got to get it right away. So there's some built-in ordering of what we do based on the invasiveness of the species. So, and we've been successful in some cases of finding a species that has a small footprint on our property and being able to take it out before it expands. So nested within all of the planning is that awareness of what's happening. But we have people on the ground every day in the open space, and so I think that long-term monitoring component will be important.
And I guess invasive species, non-natives to the area, but so many of them have become endemic to the area. I think of mustard, I think of the wild oats, I think of the fennel that we've worked on for years to try to get rid of, and have done quite a bit. Are you proposing that we're going to go species by species? Are you proposing that we do area by area and march through? Because there's a lot of, this is similar to Director Nichols' questions. I think the overall goal is very admirable. I don't know how we would accomplish that without reinfection from other areas.
So you'll notice in the plan didn't have a big black mustard eradication project in it. There are certainly species that we're unlikely to achieve long-term success in the non-native annual grasses and the mustards. But we are informed by the plan kind of describes our priority one species are those that are the most invasive and cause the most damage. So that's kind of a combination of knowing which species are your greatest threats and what types of habitats are they taking advantage of, and where are those located on COSCA property. So it's like you're kind of coming in from three different directions to make a decision to go out and do something. Now, when we're on these sites working on a priority species such as a fennel, for instance, and we've had great success with fennel in a lot of places, but as we continue in these areas, we can treat other species opportunistically when we're on site. But there are some, if you say we've looked at areas of high habitat quality throughout the open space, and our long-term thought is, well, make those areas bigger and have them start connecting. So that's another strategy for identifying work areas, but we probably wouldn't be going after mustard or annual grasses if we didn't have a larger restoration plan, and that is probably years of treatment and the introduction of native plants. For COSCA, the whole restoration part of planting is difficult because logistically we have access issues on open space, and we don't have sprinklers and water sources to do on-site plantings. So most of our work will be simply trying to exhaust the seed banks of these invasive species with multi-year efforts of seed prevention. So the timing of our work on these projects is vital to success because we already have a weed seed bank out there, and some of these seeds last decades. So, we call it the grow-kill cycle. You can't take the seed out of the soil, but you can get it to germinate and then kill it when it's a plant, So it is more complex than it seems. That a lot goes into these decisions on where to work.
Yeah, I would agree with you. There's a lot of work to be done there, which leads me to one of my other questions. This is going to be an extremely expensive. Do you have thoughts on how we are going to go about providing those fundings for this remediation that we're looking for? I think it's a very good goal to have, but I know that just removing Mexican fan palms is millions of dollars.
Yeah, some of these larger cost projects will require some grant funding. So we've already applied for some grants, and we're talking with other agencies about them, because projects like, palm trees is going to be expensive. For our part, we have the Woolsey recovery funds, and we have earmarked. So we have a substantial fund to put toward projects like this. But of course, that money can go quickly on big projects. But what COSCA's funding can do is match grants and can make the acquisition of grants easier and more attractive to granting agencies if we put a little bit in of our own. And if we're able to use the Woolsey funds to match grants, then we can kind of double up on the impacts there.
It sounds like this would be a multi-year project and the plan is great. I love the plan, but multi-year, are there metrics or anything that you have set out, at least in your own mind, where we should be, say, in 5 years, 10 years?
I think we'll get to some of that when we talk about what we're proposing for this year's weed plan. But the weed plan is kind of like I said, a programmatic level, kind of broad brush look at what our threats are and the methods that we intend to use to get at them. It is kind of a different thing to figure out where we get the biggest bang for our buck, and that's kind of what we're trying to do. In the initial stages, it's making the most of the areas we've already been working on, so we can ensure success in those areas. We don't want to spread ourselves too thin because, if we concentrate resources over several years in any one given space, that's how we achieve success. So this plan isn't a 2-year plan or a 10-year plan even. It describes the methods we're going to use and the species we want to go. So we do have priorities, and we have a good idea of where all these plants are. It was a little beyond the scope of our effort in the planning to identify where every species was. We do have a good working knowledge of what's out there, so it helps just to have our staff be pretty well aware of what we have and where is it.
Two more questions. You mentioned the Woolsey fire, which is getting close to one of my areas of interest. Is there a priority in any of this mitigation? Because the invasive species also, unfortunately, contribute to fire spread and everything else. Is that part of your decision matrix as far as trying to attack species that are particularly wildfire prone?
Well, that's what you'll see in the grant applications we have out now, are recognition of multi-benefit type projects. So the palm removal is important because it does great things for the environment, but also provides for community safety. And when we can check off both of those concerns, that's obviously a greater benefit for us and for the community.
Great. And just one final question. A lot of the invasives started off as ornamentals in people's, landscaping. I think of Mexican fountain grass. That is pretty endemic now anywhere that it can grow, which started off as an ornamental. Is it part, I didn't notice in the plan, maybe I missed it, outreach to the community to try to reduce those sources of spread?
There hasn't, not from our side of this. In some areas, and I'm not intimately familiar with, if it's not an agricultural pest, it doesn't really get the attention of, say, like the County Agriculture Commissioner's office. Some weeds do register for them, and so those come up.
I can add real quick that there is a statewide organization called the California Invasive Plant Council, and they've produced quite a bit of outreach material, and they have a whole selection of brochures that are called Don't Plant a Pest. And let's say that, for example, there's a tree-specific brochure, there's a shrub-specific brochure, there's an ornamental grass-specific brochure, and those documents indicate what plants escape cultivation easily. And if, for example, somebody is interested in planting one of those, it offers a suggestion for an alternative, something that looks similar statues, provides a similar purpose in a landscape design, but doesn't have the same tendency to escape cultivation as something that's really invasive might. So there's that literature is out there. But in many cases, with all that outreach that's been ongoing on their part for a number of years now, there are several nurseries that just don't sell invasive plants in the same way that they used to. For example, pampas grass used to be quite popular, and I think increasingly it's much more difficult to find in a nursery because people recognize how readily it escapes and also the hazards associated with it. That said, there's some out in the landscape, and it's can be challenging to remove once you have an established population of it.
How do we get that word out to the folks then? Is it something that COSCA can use? Can we approach, I don't know, Armstrong Nursery and have them?
Well, the Don't Plant a Pest folks and the Plant Right campaign have already done that. That's not something that we have to do. That's already been established its own momentum for a number of years now. And the plants that we have on our radar are not really things that people are planting in an ornamental sense. For example, nobody's planting castor bean. It's planted as an ornamental in some parts of the country, but that's not something that you're going to find at Green Thumb or something.
They used to
but
sell
not
it,
not any longer.
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Director Huffer?
Yeah, it's already been mentioned by the other directors, but it's really impressive the detail you went into on this report. And I guess I feel a little guilty, having been a biology major, that I maybe should have known more of this, but then went to school in Ohio, and we didn't have species like this in Ohio. And quite honestly, most of my biology was animals rather than plants, so that's my excuse. But the details that you went into, the prioritizing as to which ones we need to address first, I really appreciate all the efforts that went into this. Toward the end of the discussion here, you talked about some of the methods of mitigating or eliminating some of these species, and the variety of manual and mechanical and chemical and biological and a lot of other methods. Certainly, manual methods would be, as Director Engler pointed out, extremely expensive and time-consuming. We certainly don't have the staff to do it ourselves, and I have to assume that it's not the sort of thing that you would send crews of volunteers out to take care of, unless they went to some fairly extensive training. But one of the methods that you discussed here were chemical methods, and you listed several different chemicals that could be used in treating invasive species. But I'm just wondering if the methods that you'd be looking at somewhere down the line are at least somewhat dependent on whether the invasive species is an area that is, say, close to trails where there'd be likely people and or wildlife going through these areas, and whether some of the chemical methods, and I guess the one that jumped out at me was glyphosate, because that got all kinds of headlines 5 or 10 years ago. Whether chemical methods like that would be restricted or limited in areas that might affect humans and or wildlife.
So where we went with that was in terms of the various methodologies. Some of the species have like primary methods, and others that you work up to based on the size of your infestation. The chemicals that we chose is actually it's a very small selection of what's available out on the market. The chosen ones have the least environmental impacts, we'll say, and in terms of their ability to move throughout the environment as well. Any regulation of those could change, the methodology we might use for any particular species. But every species, depending on its growth method, and I don't know if I'm finding the right word for that, but there isn't like one chemical that does everything great. So there's a couple that are available that we've chosen ones that won't travel in the environment. But I think what's most important in there in terms of how herbicides are used in weed management and wildland areas is that, this is not a tractor with a boom sprayer covering large areas. This is generally the methods described in the plan are direct application to a specific plant. So there's not like any distribution of it in a wide area. Most of the infestations that COSCA has, fortunately, are dispersed over very large areas. So it's really just picking them apart. In areas that are closer to a trail, we may choose to do a manual method there while addressing ones that are more distant with different methods. I think what the plan also describes is how the application methods and to what part of the plant and how much of the plant. So for arundo, for instance, you've seen these giant stands of it. So there isn't treatment of all that biomass because that would take a lot of chemical. So we remove all that biomass, and as it sprouts up, you just hit the leaves of the new ones. So it's possible to do weed management using very little product, and that's kind of how we approach the use of chemicals. on COSCA's property.
Okay. And I guess by definition, invasive species are species that got brought in from somewhere on the outside and seem to be taking over the more native species. But and again, I'm not a scientist or former scientist way back when, but I know with certain insects and other life like that scientists are able to find some other insect that can get rid of the undesirable insect. Is there any biological methods similar for plants that some kind of natural flora can help get rid of some of the invasive species?
So biocontrols are an incredibly complicated thing, because as soon as you bring something in that you think only attacks one thing, it often attacks another. So we were conspicuous in our plan to say that we are not suggesting any biological control methods, only because the decisions on whether or not to do that should be made at the state level. And there are whole research departments at universities that have the scientific credentials to make such a decision. We would not presume to make those decisions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I just have a few questions, and I'll echo what all the other directors have said by way of thanks. This is very extensive plan. I appreciate, given how much focus we've put in the past on the fire dangers, the immediate fire dangers of things like fan palms or arundo grasses or Russian thistle. There are many other species described here, and it's a very thorough look at all of them, and I appreciate that. You had mentioned in your presentation, I'll ask now this Chumash question I started early on before, that there was no response from the Barbareño-Ventureño board. My question on that is COSCA in discussion with any other Chumash groups? My understanding is there are only 4 federally recognized Chumash groups, but something like 14 in total in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties. But not all of them are organized, but not all are federally recognized. I wonder if we have communications with any of the other groups.
We do not. We went with, we modeled our notifications and invitations for consultation on what the city normally does for the city sponsored CEQA documents. So that's why we followed up with that group specifically. The methods we suggest do not cause a lot of ground disturbance, and so it's most likely just that they thought, well, maybe that doesn't have a big impact, or because we know that that the open space has cultural remnants in it that are valuable. So we didn't suggest deep ripping or ground disturbing activities, because not only do they pose a risk to cultural materials, but they also damage the soil, and you'll often just be creating more weed habitat by disturbing weed habitat. So we like to try and keep our soil as intact as possible.
Absolutely. I've been involved with previous hearings on the city side where there has to be great sensitivity, not only in how the soils are treated or left alone, but also even in information sharing, where we don't want relic hunters or the general public to rush in and say, oh, there's something here, we want to go check it out. We don't want to be a part of that. So
no, we didn't. Yeah, you'll notice our plan didn't include locations of any cultural resources.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I also appreciate that, as you said at the outset, this agency's primary mission is to enhance and preserve open space, full stop. we have talked in the past about fire prevention. We've talked a lot about the 3 species, and we've had other meetings specifically on the topic of brush clearance. I realize this is a much larger and longer lasting, the scope of this plan is a many-year project. But I'm wondering as well if there's been any consultation with the county fire department or other fire prevention agencies in formulating the plan.
Not specifically for this plan, but for in terms of the invasive species that, I guess, for lack of a better term, I call mobile fuels, things like the Russian thistle that carry fire across a landscape, and the fan palms, which create high ember loads. The fire department's been very supportive of the work we're doing, and we have grant applications out now for which the fire department has written support letters. So the invasive species that also have a nexus with fire safety, we have prioritized those. It also happens to be where most of the available grant funding is these days, because the state has put a high priority on fire safety. So we think our best contribution beyond the work we're already doing for defensible space preparation is to try and address the fuels here that have the potential to cause the most damage in the community. So we are out actively seeking grants for primarily the fan palms and the Russian thistle.
This is a really important point. It's not, oftentimes things get phrased, or the narrative becomes we can do public safety or we can do conservation, and it's not an either or. In fact, this is a perfect example where they are the same thing. They are one and the same.
Well, COSCA's management principles and guidelines are fairly clear on the matter that public safety is a high priority along with our conservation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So everything we do, we try our hardest to make a good balance between those 2 goals.
And as well, outside of the plan now, just this is it's a standard practice and has been for COSCA's entire existence, has it not, that there's regular communication between the 2 agencies, the fire department and COSCA.
We're regularly in contact.
Yeah.
Especially this time of year, very frequent contact.
Right.
But
in the weeks leading up to June 1st, yes.
Yeah, but we have ongoing conversations with them too, and the fire department's been supportive of the projects we've been proposing. So I think we've come a long way even just in the last year in terms of understanding how we can best support each other's work.
Very good. And then my final question is around the reinfestation prospects that Director Nichols mentioned. Director Engler touched on this a bit as well. I'm hopeful. My take in reading the document was in enumerating different methods, and there's an assessment of the usefulness of each method for each species. Is it the case that the choice of method is itself a preventive measure for reinfant? So like I forget the species, but there was something where we didn't use one method because it would cause seeds to spread far and wide. So we use this other method instead. And that in itself, just the fact that we're choosing this method, is intrinsically a means of preventing reinfestation.
So the habit of each species and its development form, how it progresses through the year, how long does its seed last in the soil once deposited, all these are considerations for how we might address any individual weed species. So it's, and there may be cases where you start with one method, and then as you start gaining control, you can switch methods. So it kind of does come down to each of understanding, what are the habits of this plant, and how do we interrupt that habit so it becomes less successful in our landscape.
So on that point, I think what I don't want to put words in either Director Nichols or Engler's mouths, but on the general question of specific implementation details or procedures, and then success metrics for that implementation. I wonder if it might make sense a bit down the road, and I'm not proposing a fixed date, but 2 years, 3 years, 5 years out, to revisit this and say, are we actually achieving? There are many, many good decisions in here, and they are species specific.
Mm-hmm.
But would it make sense regularly to reevaluate where we're at and say, well, did this thing that we thought was going to work, did it actually work the way we expected it to?
Well, I think that speaks to the monitoring component of any of the work that we do. You know, we're not, like others have mentioned, you know, we're working in a large landscape and there's lots of different plants in it, and they can, you know, reinfestation can happen. What our goal is with each project is, as we remove the invasive species, it ideally promotes the growth of the native species. Once a certain you can achieve a certain amount of health in the landscape of a native plant community, they do become more resilient to the infestations. Most of our infestations are a function of some kind of land disturbance in the past, or a past land use that causes. So it's really, how do we, you know, considering our land use now is passive open space and wildlife habitat. You know, the ultimate goal is to expand the native plant communities to a point where they can compete ideally on their own over time. There's areas where we know it's not realistic to expect that we'll have, 100% native cover, but if you can change a 25% native cover to a 70% native cover, the functional habitat improvement makes a big difference.
Very good. Again, thanks very much for this report. Are there any other questions or a motion on this plan? Don't all speak at once.
I would move staff recommendations on this. I just want to make one other comment that in reading through the mitigations that you've described, I think the mitigations should handle any expectation of reducing the impact to less than substantial. So, thank you for that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you.
So
There's a motion
I would move the item
based on staff's recommendations.
based on staff. Thank you. Based on staff recommendations.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Will the clerk please prepare us for a vote?
Yes, and we have no speakers either.
Thank you.
Director Engler,
Yes.
Director Huffer,
Yes?
Director Nichols,
Yes.
Chair Newman.
Aye.
Motion carries 4-0. Director Sullivan absent.
Again, kudos on a very well done plan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next item is 6C, the approval of appropriation from Woolsey Fire Recovery Fund for targeted invasive plant removal projects and authorization for COSCA Co-Chief Administrative Officer to execute associated contracts. Mr. Stark.
Actually,
This will be.
Oh,
good evening, Chair Newman
good evening,
and
Ms.
members of the
Ms.
board.
Hoover.
This item pertains to a request for your approval of an appropriation from the Woolsey Fire Recovery Fund for targeted invasive plant removal projects, and I have a very brief PowerPoint. Wait. As you know, and as you've recently heard, invasive plant species are a threat to ecological processes, native plant communities, and the persistence of native species in COSCA open space areas. As open space areas under COSCA management are bordered by a mix of residential communities, rural areas, and vacant private lands, COSCA lands require proactive monitoring and management to maintain the integrity of our existing biological resources. Between the increasing prevalence of invasive plants in the broader landscape and the impact of the 2018 Woolsey fire, many of COSCA's open space areas are being increasingly affected by such species. In previous years, COSCA has implemented small projects such as fennel control on the Western Plateau and Italian thistle control along the whole access trail. With our new invasive plant management plan, however, our plans for 2026 are more ambitious. This year, we're planning to work in 17 locations throughout open space, which are illustrated in the slide before you. The locations are Hawk Canyon, Hill Canyon, Labisco Hill, Lang Ranch, the Los Padres Trail Corridor, Lot 618, the Lower Santa Rosa Trail, Morro Circle, Rancho Potrero, an area behind Shenandoah Street, the Sunrise Loop Trail, the Sunset Hills Trail, Vista Del Mar, the Western Plateau, the Whole Access Trail, and 2 locations in the Woodridge open space area. And we're planning to target 14 invasive species. They are, from left to right and top to bottom, artichoke thistle, carnation spurge, castor bean, fennel, giant reed, Italian thistle, Mexican fan palm, milk thistle, poison hemlock, Russian knapweed, Russian thistle, tree spurge, tree tobacco, and yellow star thistle. To accomplish this work, staff is requesting an appropriation of $200,000 from the allocation assigned to weed management and habitat restoration in the Woolsey Fire Recovery Fund framework. The current unappropriated balance of this allocation is $2,042,531. Selection of an appropriate contractor would occur through a competitive RFP process. The selected contractor will be highly proficient in native and non-native plant identification, will possess a valid C27 landscape contractor license, and will be licensed by the California Department of Pesticide Regulation. Individuals performing any herbicide application will also be required to have appropriate licensing from the state. Execution of contract documents would occur by the COSCA Co-Chief Administrator. Preservation and improvement of native habitats is facilitated and made more effective by strategic control of non-native plants. As COSCA is focused on responsible stewardship of open space, improving our land and the habitats it supports, it's of significant importance and will move land management goals forward in a tangible way. The project also aligns with actions listed in the COSCA strategic plan, including guiding principle number 2, which pertains to stewarding natural resources, objective 2.1, which relates to habitat enhancement, and several habitat management related implementation actions. And with that, staff recommends that the board of directors, 1, find that the proposed project falls within the scope of actions described in the COSCA Invasive Plant Management Plan and its associated mitigated negative declaration, and with implementation of the mitigation measures adopted in the MND, the project, as mitigated, will avoid or reduce all potentially significant impacts to a less than significant level, and no additional CEQA review is required. And number 2, authorize staff to expend up to $200,000 from the Woolsey Fire Recovery Fund for implementation of targeted invasive plant removal projects in selected open space areas, and authorize the COSCA Co-Chief Administrative Officer to execute associated contracts. Thank you, and with that, I'm available for your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Huber. Questions? Director Huffer.
Would I be correct that this is the first time we've taken on a project of this scope?
Yes, because we have our bright, shiny new IPMP, which provides the necessary umbrella to have a bright, shiny new CEQA document.
Okay, and then the question I have then is, you've identified, I don't know, 15 or 20 different locations and 1 or 2 or several species within each of those locations. The allocation that you're asking for, the authorization that you're asking for, what basis do you have in thinking that the amount of funds you're asking for is going to do much or most or all of the treatment areas that you have outlined in this document, or is this sort of a shot in the dark and don't really know yet how much it's going to cost us to do all of this?
It is a calculation that's based on the previous work we've done, just scaled up. So you might recall that I mentioned in the past we've done fennel control on the Western Plateau. We know the acreage that was covered there. We know the plant density that was covered, that existed in that particular area, and we know the cost from previous years. And so this is just a matter of scaling it up. In having inspected those sites and understanding what the current infestation level is, or the density of the particular target species in a given location, and then already in many cases we have in mind how we're going to treat a particular plant. For example, some plants will get just a spot of herbicide application because if you pull them, they will do nothing but resprout. Other plants, manual removal is perfectly appropriate. For example, with milk thistle, the easiest way to control that plant is when it is in flower, all you need to do is clip the flower heads, the end, right? Because then the plant is not reproducing seed and there is no contribution to the seed bank. And this year's crop of seed is going to be eliminated from the cycle of regeneration for future years. There may still be seed left in the seed bank, so one would have to go back to that site next year and the year after to see if anything germinates. But as an example, that is a plant that is really easy to control manually, and it doesn't cost very much.
I might add that as we work each season on these, we're reducing the seed bank, we're reducing the above ground biomass, so the amount of work that it takes on any given site decreases rather logarithmically once you get started.
And are you looking for an individual contractor to tackle one site at a time or multiple sites, or?
It'll be, the scope of work will consist of multiple sites with each target species listed, a map listed, and what the treatment prescription is going to be.
Okay, and what sort of time frame are you looking at to first let these contracts, but then have the contracted work accomplished?
So, for example, Italian thistle is a plant that is blooming now. That will be the first plant that we target because it is an annual, and if it goes to seed, then that seed is being contributed to the seed bank, and then we have a whole crop of plants next year. So that, as an example, that's something that's going to get hand pulled in the very near future. We have had success working with a particular company in the past. They're very, very skilled at it, and that's the route that we will very likely go with that. The other species bloom later in the year, so for those, there's a much broader range. And for example, you might know Russian thistle, commonly called tumbleweed. That doesn't germinate until June. And so that work is going to happen much later once the plant has actually appeared in our landscapes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Are there other questions of staff? Director Engler.
Thank you. Just to tag along with my colleagues here, the questions, $200,000 seems like a pretty good bargain, actually. Does that include, would that contract be for an annual basis, or because I am sensitive to the idea of revisiting, looking for ones that were missed or ones that resprouted of all these types of species. is the intent of having a series of $200,000 contracts year to year, or is that all encompassing as we go forward?
It will depend on each year. For example, for a project that's specific to arundo removal, giant reed, that interestingly in our region, arundo does not produce viable seed. So a lot of people hate treating arundo, but really it's a fantastic species to treat because it doesn't produce seed. All you have to do for your treatment of that plant is you systematically work to exhaust the carbohydrate stores in its rhizomes. But in doing that takes a few seasons to get through. So a project like that, for example, would have a multi-year obligation, because we wouldn't want to start fresh with somebody on the project next year if a particular contractor has already started removing it this year. But year to year it depends, because some species reproduce by seed, some species reproduce vegetatively. Many of the species that are here have been treated in the past, and some of the operations this year are simply mop-up operations. For example, we've successfully treated artichoke thistle in the past. This year, I really expect only to find 3 or 4 plants in the landscape. The same thing with the Russian knapweed. That's been successfully treated in the past, and that is just simply a mop-up operation this year to see if we have odd seedlings here and there, because control efforts have already snuffed out much of the population.
Well, I am encouraged by that we are having some success, and that we're doing the revisiting year by year, and look forward to more success in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other questions of staff? Director Nichols?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair for the day, Vice Chair. Chair. Okay, good. We'll take it.
Chair for the year.
Oh, good. All right. I too have some questions regarding the funding, and I'm just thinking, if you're going to calculate this out, and I know you've talked about some mop-up operations, contractor with some experience that you've done in the past, and maybe those are some of the behind the scenes type of, or behind the curtain type of calculations. But I'm just looking at this. If I were to receive this request for proposal, and I think a valid contractor, I'm starting to pencil things out, and I'm looking at going 18 different sites with multiple types of treatment with various skilled staff members, and these aren't roadside locations. I've got a hike to get to some, if not all of them. So there's time involved, there's skill involved, there's materials involved, there's tools involved, transportation involved. To me, I just don't see how it pencils out, and without seeing your, show me your work type of thing, I don't see that. So I'm just curious, and I know you've kind of addressed that, but I'm just wondering, how confident are you that you're going to get a reliable contractor to offer a bid within that $200,000 and be successful?
The bid that is going to go out will definitely be keeping in mind the work that needs to be done and the treatment approach for a particular target species, as well as the density of that species in a given treatment area. If we were treating let's say a monoculture of tree spurge that covered 3 acres, we would not be talking about a $200,000 request. The tree spurge that we have, for example, is a few seedlings that's over half an acre. And the same thing with some of the other species that I've talked about. The other thing that we have in mind too is that this is the first year of a highly ambitious project. I would rather, and I think we would rather start modestly so that there is even more room to scale up going forward. Because there will be some tailoring, I imagine, that goes in. But even though that this is a lot of species and a lot of locations, do keep in mind that in many instances, this is not the first year that work is being done. Work in many of these examples has been underway, and we're looking at mop-ups. So even though it's a lot of places to think about and a lot of different points on the map, most also, there is some walking involved to get to them, but generally in most cases, the sites are truck accessible, and then walking is only a very short distance. So not a lot of time is expended in having an individual, let's say, with, toting equipment, hiking. Like, somebody does not have to hike into the Western Plateau, for example. You can drive into the Western Plateau.
Okay. All right. Can you give me one example for, like, Labisco Hill?
Mm-hmm.
You have the whole hill painted red. So I'm thinking, oh my gosh, someone has to cover every square foot of that hill to do whatever task there is.
So with what that,
how does that play out?
The way that happens is because in order to put something like this together, we don't have the luxury, especially because our target species is not really germinated yet, right? It germinates later in the year. So I don't have the luxury of making a vegetation map showing with point data where each target plant is. I could do that with palm trees, for example. They are a large characteristic and easily spotted species on the landscape. But Russian thistle, not so much. So to treat Labisco Hill, what we do is we request a team of 4 applicators who walk abreast with backpack sprayers and then systematically traverse the hillside in a band and then spot spray as they encounter something.
Okay. With that said, to me, I'm thinking, well, what does success look like? So success looks like that in all these locations, after all this project work is done, those undesirable plants no longer reside there.
Right.
But with that goal in mind, how do you assess the contractor's work in complying with reaching that goal when it may take time to figure out if it actually gets there or not?
Well, so in preparing the scope of work, each site is going to be inspected ahead of time so that we understand what's there. I can just say, anecdotally, in the past, what I've done is, for example, because of the amount of time that I'm outside, I have a good sense of how much fennel we still have on the Western Plateau, right? And if a contractor takes the time to prepare a responsible bid, he or she will also go to all these locations and have a look at them and see what's actually going on. But entertainingly, in past years, we've had contractors not go out and have just prepared a bid based on the maps, not understanding plant density, terrain, access, or any of it. And the bids are really quite entertaining to read. But we'll have the front end knowledge about what we know is there. For example, the Western Plateau is a large area. A large area has been treated in the past. So the polygon is quite big. What is actually there, scattered across the landscape, is very few plants, right? But you have to walk to find them. But a good contractor who is well versed in habitat restoration and going after invasive species, that's what they're really all about. And they will ferret out those plants. But other contractors who maybe have some level of familiarity with weed work because they're a landscape maintenance contractor, they will not do that. And but you can tell in a bid when somebody hasn't taken the time to do their homework. But our homework will be done ahead of time. Okay.
Well, I'm a little relieved to know that some of these are mop-up areas and that someone doesn't have to cover every square foot of Labisco Hill.
Right.
Now, they may be able to view it, but they don't have to actually put foot on every square
Right.
foot.
Right.
And because that's what I had envisioned is, oh my gosh, they have to cover the whole thing, and it's going to take them, a week just to get up and down all those areas. So with that said, I think maybe I just didn't understand that there was just kind of spot treatment, so to speak,
Mhm.
rather than massive amounts of work in all these locations. And of course, I'm also thinking of, if you hire someone to trim a tree, you can pretty much tell before and after whether they did the work or not.
Mm-hmm.
But in this instance, when you're talking about time passing before you can really see results, and sometimes it takes extensive time, that there's a little harder to track some of that.
Well,
So-
what also goes, so for example, if the treatment methodology is going to be manual removal, your proof that the work is done is a dead plant laying on the ground, right? If somebody pulled it or used a hoe to cut the plant, like, okay, look, we don't have any more living Russian, or I can't use Russian knapweed because that's not a good one to hoe. But let's say, for example, milk thistle, right? And let's say that the scope of work is requesting that the flower heads all be bagged and clipped. Well, milk thistle is an annual, so if you go back and check the site and have a look at your milk thistle plants, which will still be there, but if all the flowers are gone, the work is done, and that plant isn't going to go to seed, because as an annual, the reproductive cycle has already been interrupted with the flowers having been removed. If it happens to be a plant where we're doing very careful spot application of herbicide, the tank mix has a photodegradable marking dye in it, right? You've probably seen that before. Can be either pink or kind of a bluish color. That facilitates the applicator's ability to know where they have already sprayed, and also helps product be used effectively, so nobody is double spraying or triple spraying, like, did I do that plant already or what? And that's also your proof that the target has been hit, because it has that tint on it.
Mhm. Well, thank you for the further explanation. I know this is a significant
I hope that helps.
project.
I can
Oh, yeah.
tell you more.
No, like I said, I just saw all these areas painted red, and I
Mhm.
thought, oh my gosh, could this possibly get done? But obviously, those people interested in making a bid, like you said, if they're going to do it the smart way, they'll need to
Mhm.
do a little homework on that.
Right.
So thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the report and the ask. Thanks to fellow board members who have asked all of my questions. So I have none, and having none, we'll entertain a motion on this item.
I'll go ahead and make a motion this time to follow staff recommendation regarding the finding and also authorizing the expenditure of the $200,000.
Very good, thank you. Will the clerk please prepare us for a vote?
Second.
Sorry, we have a second. And now will the clerk please prepare us for a vote?
And we have no speaker cards either. Director Engler,
Yes.
Director Huffer,
Yes?
Director Nichols,
Yes.
and Chair Newman.
Aye,
Motion carries 4-0, Director Sullivan absent.
very good. Our final action item this evening is item 6D, the authorization to allow the use of prescribed grazing on a portion of the Rancho Potrero open space to support restoration of native grassland habitat.
Are you tired of hearing about weeds yet? So one more here is, staff is seeking authorization to use prescribed grazing as a weed management project as part of restoring native grass habitat out at the Rancho Potrero open space. We have two actions we're requesting. One is to find that the proposed project falls within the scope of actions described in the COSCA invasive plant management plan and its associated mitigative negative declaration. With implementation of mitigation measures adopted in the M&D, the project as mitigated will avoid or reduce all potentially significant impacts to a less than significant level, and that no additional CEQA review is required. And to authorize staff to undertake a prescribed grazing program on 50 acres of the Rancho Potrero open space for natural resource management purposes, and to prepare an RFP or RFPQ for grazing services. I have a PowerPoint slide to share. So the Rancho Potrero open space consists of 303 acres southwest of the city of Thousand Oaks and includes areas characterized as rocky outcrops, chaparral, and grasslands on the lower flat areas. A 50-acre portion of this grassland is dominated by invasive non-native annual grasses that have outcompeted native bunch grasses, and this has fundamentally altered habitat quality for birds, other wildlife, pollinators, and native plant communities. COSCA seeks to restore habitat quality at Rancho Potrero by reducing invasive annual grasses, increasing coverage by native perennial grasses, and incorporating valley oaks within the grassland area, and suppressing annual grasses and dealing with accumulated grass thatch is our first step. So generally, we do still have native bunch grasses within this area. There are patches of them here and there. So the strategy here would be, as Anna described with her other projects, of depriving them of seed production and removal of the thatch so that the native bunch grasses can expand. The invasive annual grasses create complete coverage of the area, and they outcompete native perennial grasses. The dense thatch also prevents native seed germination. The grasses we have out there do practice allelopathy, which is just a big word for saying they create biochemicals of their own that help suppress the germination of native species. And the dense thatch cover reduces habitat quality for raptors, mainly because we have continuous ground cover, so a hunting bird can't see the rodents. When you have native bunch grasses, there's space and niches within it that gives the sporting chance for the raptor and provides a superior hunting habitat. Also, ground nesting birds do better when there's a spacing between the native grasses. They won't find much available ground nesting habitat with the species we have out there now. And lastly, the dense thatch also does create a heavier fuel load in the landscape adjacent to an existing riparian habitat restoration project that was installed many years ago adjacent to the equestrian center. That project's been very successful, and so this will add a little safety buffer for them. The native perennial bunch grasses are much better. They create less thatch buildup, allowing for more open ground. The open ground provides superior hunting habitat for raptors and superior nesting sites for ground nesting birds. The perennial grasses have deeper roots as well, and they recover quickly after wildfires. The benefit of the native grass in terms of the root depth is really important, because the purple needle grass that's out there now, those roots will go 14 feet down. And then during the summer when they dry out, the roots retract and it leaves capillaries in the soil where moisture can get down in there, and it stimulates bacterial and fungal activity in the soil, making the soil much healthier and able to sustain native plant communities. So it helps with soil health. The perennial grass also maintains higher fuel moisture for most of the year, so it's a little less volatile. And also the spaces between the bunch grasses create niche habitats for native wildflowers and forbs, so it might be a beauty enhancement too. The native bunch grasses are resilient to short duration grazing and often produce a new seed crop right after their graze. So if you can graze them at the area at the right time, they can take out the seeding capacity of the invasive annuals, but then they'll pop up and make seeds. So it's inhibiting seeding of one species and promoting the seeding of another, so in the hopes that it will expand. The native bunch grasses also practice their own form of allelopathy and can create biochemical responses that can support the continuance of native grass species. So why animals? COSCA evaluated a number of methods for control of the annual grasses in this area. Herbicide was not selected due to the volume that would be necessary, just it's too much area to use. And also herbicide wouldn't do anything to remove the thatch layer, and to be successful we need the thatch to be removed. Mowing was considered, but it would have also required repeated, probably a raking process, and driving tractors and rakes and stuff over the soil, can cause its own kind of disturbance to the area. And we didn't think that we would have as good of an outcome in terms of thatch removal. Prescribed grazing by sheep or goats provides a more efficient removal of the thatch, particularly because they just convert it into nutrient pellets and leave it on the ground. The way that we anticipate the animals would be used is put in for high density, short duration, so it's in and out. And we will, the scope of work will say, 70% biomass removal or something like that. That's how we would measure it, by residual matter left on the soil. Oh, and also the grazing doesn't compact soil as much as driving tractors over it, so it's about soil health too. So COSCA's, I guess I'll mention, as part of this, we do anticipate coming and planting some oak trees. Anna and I did put 150 acorns out there in November, so still a little early to find them, but we hope a couple of them came out. Like, we had leftovers in Anna's private stash of acorns. So we hope to get some of those going. But so our long-term vision is an oak savanna, valley oak savanna type habitat with, widely spaced valley oak trees along with the grassland and wildflowers. So COSCA's board-approved management policies and guidelines do contain a prohibition of livestock grazing on COSCA open space unless approved by the board, and that's why we're here today. The intent of the policies and guidelines document was to prohibit the use of natural forage for commercial purposes and to protect native plant communities. So it really wasn't, it was just so we didn't become a cattle grazing agency. The proposed activity is for the purpose specifically of natural resource management. It's temporary or periodic in frequency, and annual prescriptions are based on the site monitoring from the last season. So it's, again, this can be wagged by weather and other site conditions. Livestock have been used successfully as part of integrated pest management projects nationwide, and these programs utilize, again, the high intensity short duration grazing during specific seasons. So what we hope to start this year, we won't be able to get out there with animals early enough in the season to prevent seeding this year. But our primary goal for the first year is the thatch removal. So it's hard to get an animal this time of year because we're in the weed abatement fuels management period. So unless you've booked your animals way in advance, they're going to be booked already this year. So our plan this year is just to wait until after the brush management the fuels management season's over and people are looking for new places to send their animals. So the animals won't be left in any one section beyond the performance metrics being met. So as soon as they meet that, the performance metric, they'd be removed. So the beauty of using the grazing in a timed manner is that the native grasses are really resilient, and so as soon as they get grazed down, they're going to throw up new seeds. But if you graze during the seed production part of the annual grass, it'll still suppress their seeds. So it's kind of a system of decreasing one and increasing another. I've done a number of these grassland projects before, and I've been surprised by the spread of the native bunch grasses if just given the space to go out and compete. I think, we lost these grasses here in this area probably just due to historic grazing practices. So it's really kind of a process of going back to that. Now, in a managed landscape like this, our grasslands evolved with herds of grazing elk and deer and stuff like that. So we don't really have those anymore. So the natural disturbance pattern that would create a healthy native grassland and wildflower prairie type, they need some form of disturbance to be successful over time. And this kind of speaks to that idea of what if the annual grasses just come back? So in the projects I've done on these before, they will need to be periodically disturbed manually. So we'll recreate the roving elk herds with sheep. But that'll be down the line. We don't anticipate, once we start seeing, some success out here, we will be modifying the grazing regime as we see the monitoring results. There may come a time when we don't want to do that. May go into a manual, get the weed whips out and dial in certain areas on our own. Because at a certain point, it may be more cost effective to do that. The grazing on a project like this side will run about $55,000 a season. COSCA has received a grant from the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy to do 2 seasons of the prescribed grazing at this site. But utilization of the grazing animals for resource management is a lot different than what they might be used for, the fuels management, where it's about getting rid of everything. Ours is specifically timed, a certain number of animals for a certain amount of time to achieve a certain specific natural resource goal. So it's a little bit different, and I think that's the intent of where our management policies and guidelines were, is that we didn't want to be a grazing agency, but we wanted the flexibility to use animals productively if the board found that it was an appropriate use. So with that in mind, I'm happy to take questions.
Very good. Thank you. Questions, Director Nichols?
Yes, I'll start with a couple. First of all, I think it's a great idea. I love the concept. I mean, I've been involved with these types of projects before, and the results can be fantastic. Not specifically for bunch grass, but more for the fuel reduction process. I have heard, I don't know that it's rumor or fact, that sheep and goats graze differently as far as what their preferences are, whether it be the palate or the physical chomping of the vegetation. And I see you have both sheep or goats. Is there a preference as to what animal or even what breed of sheep or goats would be preferred for something like this?
The preferred animal would be the sheep.
The sheep? Okay.
But we aren't very plugged in with the animal availability program, so it may be that a goat would be used, but maybe it's a shorter duration, for instance. Sheep are preferential eaters, so they'll almost eat, you could almost predict what they'll eat in a landscape because they only eat one species at a time. Or in most cases, the projects I've done with grazing, the sheep are very specific, and they'll eat one species at a time. They always start with fennel. They eat dessert first. But if you have heavier, depending on what species you're after too, we're looking at grasses. If we had more shrubby type growth and things like that, a more robust mustard, things like that, a goat might be more effective because they have a higher tolerance for silica in their palate. So sometimes you could put a sheep on a field and it'll eat the plant down to here, but the goat will take it down to there. And a cow might even take it even more. We're not suggesting that we would use cattle in this location. I think it's too big of an animal for soil compaction, and they're a little slower. At least a sheep eats 8 hours a day.
Okay, and then another question I had was, you've got a very interesting looking polygon there. And I didn't know if you're going to be, if there was a requirement for or an option for whether it's herding or fencing to restrict them. And are those lines exact, or is that like general, and if they kind of wander a little bit, that's not a problem?
Our grant is for 50 acres. So this is how we gerrymandered the 50 acres. But you'll see we went around some hummocks of higher ground that have different vegetation communities on them. So we didn't choose to graze those because we wanted to keep what we had.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, it's kind of, and some of this is built on elevation contours,
Okay.
because the contours tend to affect what's growing in any
Mhm.
given place.
Mhm.
So it's kind of used, it's a combination of trying to reach an acreage value while trying to target the species that we want and the type of habitat we want. So those are generally the lower elevation areas. There's also a drainage area that runs through it, which this area is not a free roam area. For the prescribed grazing to be effective, you need to confine the animals.
Mhm.
So you get a density on a certain land unit, because that's how they calculate. It's animal unit days per acre is the unit of measurement for prescribed grazing. So
Mhm.
the contractor will bring their own fencing and fence out these areas, and they'll probably have to do it in blocks
Separate,
across
yeah.
the
Mhm.
area just to keep the density appropriate.
Mhm. Okay. And then just as a follow-up, seems like we've got a lot of areas in our open space that would be amenable to something like this. Just curious, how did this one get picked first?
This is one large piece of fairly flat ground with a limited number of species targeted. It's a good test case. It has good access. But this is a learning process. We're going to go out and do this. We'll measure, monitor, and
Mhm.
improve our methodologies. But it's not beyond reach that, other large grassland areas, wildwood or something like that,
Mhm.
could be treated this way. We just start. I mean, this is already at 50 acres. It's a pretty big project as it is.
Yeah.
So, what we learn here will be applicable in other areas, but I don't
Mhm.
anticipate that we would be doing this on more than one site at any given time.
Mhm. Okay, well, I think Chino Hills does this on a regular basis in some of their open space as well, but that's mostly for fire reduction.
Yeah, ours will be timed a little bit differently.
Yeah.
So, and our performance metric of how much is, we're not about remove everything.
Mhm.
It's, have they sufficiently knocked the stuff down? We want to leave enough biomass in the soil to hold the soil together
Yeah,
for erosion prevention. But it's also, even in the short term, we can create better ground nesting bird habitat if we still had, some differential conditions, like
Mhm.
where it's not all the same. And that's generally what you'll get is a patchwork of grazed intensities.
Mhm.
So
Very good. Thank you, great idea, thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Director Huffer and then Director Engler.
Yeah, I'm just visualizing this group of sheep and bringing back some memories. We first moved into our home just beneath the Mount Clef Ridge
Mhm.
45 years ago. And I remember the first time I walked out the door and there was this gentleman herding his sheep over the hill from Santa Rosa Valley and down into the fields there where now all the sports facilities are located. So it'd be interesting. And I have to admit, I'm something of a fan of the Old West books and movies with the cowboys and the cow ranchers and their battles with the sheep herders and the concerns that sheep were just stripping all of the grass that the cattle were to be feeding on, and some of the battles that supposedly went on in the Old West. I'm sure the books and movies were totally exaggerating But what struck me in your discussion here was that final statement, you said native bunch grasses are resilient to grazing. And it sounds to me, the way you're describing this, that you're not just going to throw a bunch of sheep out there and they're going to sit there for weeks and months and stripping all of the growth of any kind out there, that it's going to be monitored, and that historically, and then the Native Americans, as you were talking about, historically, controlled grazing does actually have benefits for the natives. So it's going to be interesting to see how this works out. You said this is a test case, so it's going to be very interesting to see how this works out. We certainly do appreciate the financial support from the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy to help fund this project. Did you say that you're estimating the cost would be only $5,000?
No, it's about $55,000 a year for
Okay,
an area this large, and that's based on kind of a statewide average. We will of course go out to bid on the grazing service, and we'll write the prescription, but it'll be helpful. We have resources in our county through the NRCS, and we have grazing advisor at the Resource Conservation District. So there are people in our county that can provide some guidance for us as we enter into this. I think what you're saying about the old cowboy days, that I guess it's you're going to support whatever animal you raise, right? But the thing is where grazing has been problematic in land management is when there isn't like a prescription, because even cattle ranchers move their cattle around, and a smart sheep person would move them around too, to protect the vitality of the ground and the vegetation. But any time that we start but in the old days too, they didn't fence everything, so animals could linger in certain areas for quite a long time. And most of our valley, places like Lang Ranch, the past grazing practices have led to habitat damage and difficulty in restoring it. Some of these areas just be cost prohibitive. What we're trying here is a project that is generally lower cost. Restoring grasslands in general is very expensive work, and some of the projects using models the university have developed could be $100,000 an acre. Well, that's not very realistic. So, and those projects also started with dousing the whole place with herbicides. So what we're trying here is just, we're not the first ones to think of this. This is a pretty regular activity that people may use animals for. It'll be a first run for us here. And I did projects with prescribed grazing on Cal Poly's campus when I worked up in San Luis Obispo. I had the benefit of having student interns sitting on all the fence posts logging what the animal was eating every 5 minutes. So we could tell exactly when they would start getting to the natives, and then we pull them out and we log it. So you can develop prescriptions over time based on the monitoring of, if I put this many animals on this area for this duration, what do I get? And what we hope is through a couple seasons, and maybe even doing some test sections within it to educate ourselves, and because every site ultimately has its own capacity and its own ability to recover and come back. So we kind of don't want to start too aggressively here. But we have high hopes that if we could just change the balance of seed production, that, like I said before, it's not about 100% native grasses in here, but it's a strong representation of them. Once we reach a certain percentage, we'll start seeing the raptors come back in.
Well, as I said, it'll be interesting to see how this progresses, and I don't know if we're going to have to monitor parking at Rancho Potrero, but as word gets out in the community, the parents want to bring their kids in. Oh, let's go watch the sheep. So,
well,
Thank
right?
you.
Well, we can sell they can't feed them because I need them eating our stuff.
Director Engler.
Well, I'm encouraged to hear you using low-paid students to do some of your work for you. That's great. Thank you. The question I have really, I love the idea of this. I would encourage us to also consider some use of animals for reducing fire loading and stuff like that as well as we go to this, because I really appreciate the fact that by removing some of these non-natives, we're improving the fire scene up close to our residences. So as we progress, I hope we progress in that direction as well.
I still think on our property, for the most part, if we're following our management principles and guidelines, it's still natural resource based. This was a good test opportunity to try something. If we look at the aerial units of our brush management program, the average size is under an acre. So the logistics of moving animals in and out, plus, what would take, 3 days for sheep to eat could be done in 25 minutes with a weed whipper. So, and because of our weed management work is bid out, we've just never had an animal contractor bid on weed abatement. I think down the line, if we're looking at if we look long term at habitat improvements, there are several sites within our holdings where such a method might be effective. So this is a good place to start and give it a shot.
Great. And then in terms of, I've limited experience with goats and things that we grew as kids, but my memory on goats and sheep in general is that they're kind of omnivores. They'll eat just about everything. Are there other species other than just the bunch grasses that are existing out in this area here that we need to protect from the sheep or protect from the goats? Have we identified any species that we would prefer not to be eaten?
Not really. Now, there are areas with some coyote brush throughout there, but that stuff's also pretty resilient. So we're not too worried about it. There may be areas that we if I've got a really nice patch of bunch grass, maybe they fence around it. But we're counting on not, for cost effectiveness, not to try and gerrymander this so much where it's this little 10-foot circle over here gets fenced. But Anna and I have spent a fair amount of time walking this area. That I think there's like one elderberry in there someplace, and there's like a wetted area with some spike rushes in it. So those are areas that we might choose to, as we draw out and get specific with it, like what area are we going to hit and for how long.
Okay, yeah, that's go ahead, Anna.
Thank you, Director Engler. I think one thing Brian shared with you that we already played squirrel earlier this year with 150 acorns, and so those areas are all mapped. And it's a little bit tricky right now to see what may have germinated and what hasn't germinated, but I think in trying to be optimistic that we're going to have some success with those, that we might want to exclude livestock from areas where acorns were planted, just in case.
I was thinking of those little seedlings that you may have put out there.
Well, and I think that speaks to why that we need to look every year and monitor our work, because there may come a time when we do want to protect certain areas. So it's
okay. That's just a thought of mine that we want to make sure that if we have plants out there that we want to save, that we whatever we let the contractor have, that as part of the contract to identify those.
Mm-hmm.
So on the petting zoo aspect of this, there are a couple of llamas on private property along Page Lane that attract quite a crowd. So I can imagine what this will be like.
Well, we have nice trails people can enjoy out there, and CRPD has a fine picnic area overlooking the whole thing. So, yeah.
Right. I could see where it'd be very popular. I just have one question, and I realize this is somewhat dependent on animal availability and weather and ground conditions. But you mentioned that the general approach here is, quote, high density, short duration. Can you provide a bit more color on what we mean for each? How high is high and how short is short?
Well, I think we'll get like the raw numbers from a contractor to recommend, because they might have more insight. Our performance metrics will, that these have all been studied. We say, 70% biomass removal, something like that, and that's measurable out in the field. So it'll be based mostly on that. So it's performance metric based more so than us saying we're going to put this many animals on that amount of space. But
for this amount of time, it's not necessarily, I think you're saying it's not necessarily time-based, but percentage-based.
Yeah,
correct?
So there'll be a performance metric
I
for
see.
it, and then the contractor will be responsible for determining the animal units per acre to apply to that land to get the desired result. This will take, I imagine this will be a communicative project with our contractor, because we will they're going to need to bring us along and provide information to us so we can kind of understand how it's happening. But it's hard. I don't know that we would be successful if we tried to forecast how long. It's just these animals are wanderers. So if they're in too big of an area, then they're going to skip areas, and maybe there's some, more fennel over there, so they want to ignore all the other stuff. So if you want them to provide even coverage, you need to do some confining of them and move them along, just so you have sufficient density to hit the performance metric.
Yeah, and I'm a city boy who thinks goats eat cans, but
Climb trees.
I have seen temporary pens set up to control grazing in specific areas.
It's a challenge because we also have predators out in this area.
Sure.
So, that could contribute to cost and stuff that we get for bids, because they'll probably bring dogs or what else out there.
Sure. Very good. Well, thanks again. Are there any other questions before we go to a motion on this? Sure. Director Huffer?
I'd like to move approval of staff recommendations 1 and 2.
I'll second.
Very good. Thank you. Will the clerk please prepare us for a vote?
And we have no speakers. Director Engler?
Yes.
Director Huffer?
Yes.
Director Nichols?
Yes.
Chair Newman?
Aye.
Motion carries 4-0. Director Sullivan absent.
Wonderful. Let the minutes reflect that the board has bleated its approval. We move now to COSCA updates. Mr. General Manager.
No updates, but I do want to compliment both Brian and Anna on a lot of really high quality, good work. That was a lot. Well done.
Thanks. Maybe we'll start charging for it.
Concur. Yeah, thank you. And from the city side, Mr. Alicon. Very good. Thank you. Next up is board member comments. Anything beyond the very considerable discussion we've had tonight? Very good. We do not have a closed session, I believe. Excellent. So with that, I will adjourn this meeting to our next regular meeting on May 20th, 2026. Good evening.